So this will be the fifth and final talk in this series um, on healing and some basics of what it would be like to start in a session with a client, separate from any of their presenting problems, but just what are some things to know and for you to have in the back of your mind. You know, we've talked about a lot of things. Um, we've talked about how wounds aren't a one and done. Healing doesn't heal the wound in a one and done, and that in another sense that every emergence, the first one heals half of what the size of that wall between you and what you would see where you're not wounded, and sometime many of the times after a session like that, especially with a big one, a person goes out and over the next weeks and months they have many emergences, literally emergences. They have realizations as they see that one thing that they had seen, and they connect the flood of images that came that first time, and then they begin to see it in their life. And then they begin to notice themselves behaving differently. For many people, or let me say it differently, for many therapists, this is an exciting experience, especially, and I say it jokingly, when you give a client a grand mal emergence. So what if you are not, your profession is not as a therapist? Well, quite honestly, my profession is not as a therapist, even though I have that license and so on, but my profession is, I am a teacher. And my therapy is I teach human nature. And some of that involves just simply the way we are designed, which just simply has to do with knowing yourself better, and some of it is about teaching a person to see past one of those walls, one of those blocks that a startle has caused to get installed in our minds. In future talks we'll talk about exactly how that happens, and some of the more theoretical stuff to know. And it's important to know the theoretical stuff because on some days you'll get lost. And on those days you need handrails, you need something to lean on. And when you're an emergence therapist and you get stuck, you lean on the handrails, at least within a session. After the session you need to talk to others in the community. And you come to love that over time. I do. But what are we talking about? So what we're going to talk about in this talk is that that first time that you help somebody to have a grand mal aha, one that changes their whole life in so many ways, and I say that obviously kidding because mal means bad and it's not a bad thing at all, but it is an enormously, enormously powerful change in a person. Something happens after that to the therapist. I'm not sure that you would know unless you've had one of these. You can give people emergences. People do that. Regular therapists can do that, maybe once a year. They call it a breakthrough. Yeah, break through the wall. Okay. But it's not very scientific in terms of their process. It's very fortunate for the therapist and the client, but it's not very scientific. And in emergence, we need evidence of the process. We don't just need evidence of the outcome. Now, that brings us to what we're going to talk about in this rambling introduction. We're going to talk about something that happens to all people in terms of what happens after the emergence. So, I want you to imagine that you are working with a client on, let's see, the client witnessed a lot of violence in their home. The father hitting the mother multiple times, involving drunkenness. This is, drawing on the story that we used in the last talk. And there are many, many things there to emerge from. It isn't an issue. It isn't codependency. And actually the scene that we get to at the end of that drawing, where the person is imagining herself or recalling herself, a scene where the father turns to her during beating the mother and saying, "If you keep crying, I'll beat you too." Now obviously a little kid would be stunned by that statement. Some children will not be startled by it though. So stunned, maybe that's the wrong choice of words here. It wouldn't be easy for any kids, but the injury only happens if you get startled. And that startle creates a mental wall or block in the mind which is evidenced by, tested for, by an attempt to picture that kind of a scene. Now, when I start with people and they have never had an emergence, and some people who are hearing this may have known me a year and they haven't had one of these happen in a very, very deliberate way. It's happened, but this is different. So for instance, and Eric, I know you'll be watching this, I don't know when, the second half of this year sometime, because I know you're coming into the school in August. And for anybody who's hearing this years later, you may or may not know Eric. He may be famous by now. Hopefully not infamous. But he is a potentially great healer. And I think that he would probably well up if he heard me say that. Maybe you are as you're hearing this. But what is my point? Well, Eric and I have known each other at this point. It's February 2022, and we've known each other some years now, a few years, and had many good talks. And yet only recently, this is probably at least 3 years, only recently did one of these kinds of emergences come up. And he was working on becoming more willing to share his inner life in a big way with me and with another one of our close friends. And he had begun to write emails, and because I had suggested, if you have those things and you want to, you can send them to me. I will definitely read them. He had during this week or so, sent me an email, and it was a little long, and it was very insightful. And I often don't respond until I sit with the person again, until I see them again, because it's important that the person, that I can see that they see that I saw it, to say it in a rather complicated way. But remember, maxim number 1 in emergence: you can't change what you can't picture. And what you can change is what you can see. And changing a person's realization that somebody actually does want to hear them, and that they want to see them, and that they do care about them, and it's not just words, requires that they see your face in a time when this is happening. It isn't enough just to say words. People can do that. The reassurance is something, but it only matters when the person's reliving an injury in which somebody didn't care and didn't see them. That's when it matters. So after this email, maybe a week later, we got together in the era on Zoom, and he was talking about that email, etc. And I, in an attempt to say a compassionate thing, said to him, when a person writes that long of an email about their struggles, it usually indicates that that they feel that that no one listened to them in their childhood, and in some sense they're assuming that a person won't listen, or they are assuming they have the attention of an adult for 2 minutes and they're going to get everything they can in, one or the other, and some variation of that, not being heard. And I said it very simply. I just said it, it usually means that you didn't feel that you were heard when you were young. I didn't know it in that time, but it hurt him a lot. And we continued to talk. There were three of us. We continued to talk, etc. And then maybe 4 or 5 days later, he called me. And in the most respectful way, he told me that I had done something wrong to him. Now, I'm saying the words "did something wrong." He was very careful. But it was very clear that he was blaming me for his suffering. It was me. And talking to me as if, well, maybe I didn't notice it, and he just wanted to let me know, and so on. Okay. This is something that will happen to all of you. You too, Eric, this will happen to all of you in your times of sitting with people, many, many, many times. And what is it that I'm saying? Well, you as a teacher, you as a therapist, you as a nurse, practitioner, you as an acupuncturist, whatever it is that you are, use the format or the form or the license or the stage on which you are practicing emergence, whatever it is, sooner or later you will be with a client, a patient, whatever you call them, and you will step in shit. Their shit. Not yours, theirs. How will you do that? Well, because, I don't know the percentage, but well over 90% of people's startles occur in times where what they got startled by was an otherwise ordinary thing. In probably 10%, maybe 20%. I'm not trying to claim some science here. I'm not. This is my intuitive sense after, 3 decades. But in a small portion of that, there will actually have been some negative event that happened. But it will not be like that scene in the story where the father's beating the mother and he turns to the little girl and says, and if you don't stop crying, I'll beat you too. Right? Or the other story which I mentioned, in which it pushed me to discover that startles cause injuries, where I was probably getting into what might have been one of the best relationships in my life. This was certainly a person I cared about and had done a lot of work on herself, and yet, what did I do? I stepped in shit. I said, no, look into my eyes. And she screamed, take me home. Because that was what her father said as those times when she was taken to the basement with her brothers and he beat them. He prefaced it by saying, look into my eyes. So those two are extreme examples. Those fit into the 10%. Those are profoundly not only just traumatic, but they're completely understandable that that type of an injury would cause a lifelong, permanent, and somewhat widespread set of symptoms to happen, an impairment. Now, in the case of Eric, I had no idea what this was. I was kind of caught off guard. It was fine. I have seen this pattern again and again. I have had to change my shoes 10,000 times because I've stepped in shit. And what does change my shoes mean? Change my direction, listen to the person's pain, not blank out, not try to change their mind, not argue that it's not true. No, listen. This is a part of what we sign on for when we do emergence as therapists. we sign on for, at times we're going to step in shit, and we are going to be seen as the person who shit on them. And that happens. In the old words of therapists, many of whom are my heroes, that the word for that is transference. And at some point, not this year, we will explore what that really means. It doesn't just mean that we paste our unfinished business onto somebody who is in front of us. It does mean that, but it doesn't just mean that. It's much more complicated. But in this case, this is as simple as it is. Was it from something that happened to Eric that was like that kind of the two stories that I told you? No and yes. You see, I tested. After we had talked, after I had listened for perhaps 10 minutes, 8 minutes, something like that, I tested. I asked Eric to test himself, actually, and I asked him if he could picture a time which felt the same as what he was feeling. Could he picture a time? At first he said he could, but I could see, because I had emptiness in my body, that he wasn't picturing anything. And this is very common. And he and I had known each other more than 3 years and had talked about these kinds of things many times. He is not my therapy client. And so this is important that you know. He's a friend who is or has, at this point, come into the school and become an emergence practitioner. But he's accusing me of telling him that that I didn't want to hear him, that he talks too much. This is what he had been saying in a number of ways, very respectfully, not at all blaming me in the like in the way that you would somebody who had severely traumatized you. And yet he is blaming me. He believes that I am causing this because I said this thing. And toward the end of that 8 or 10 minutes I had said, do you realize that I was being compassionate? That nobody listened to you when you were a child? And he was getting mad. So I asked him to go to was there some kind of a time where somebody had not wanted to hear him? And as I said, I said, can you picture the time? And he could not, but he said he could. And this is a very common first experience when you're doing this type of emergence therapy with a person. Very common. They think they are picturing because they know the words, because they understand the words, but there's no visual material. Now, I don't just go there and say that's enough. Maybe the person's having a hard day. Maybe whatever's going on between the two of us is too stressful. And so then, I will gently ask again, and if necessary, I will ask a person to make it up. Now, if the person cannot even make it up, even when told, just an imaginary scene, just make it up. If they can't do it, I know that there's a block there. What's triggering it? Well, I don't know yet. And it's a lot of learning to know how to exactly filter through that and do all those things. And I just want to talk about this idea of knowing these things as a therapist, knowing what you should expect from yourself. Okay, so I already said a lot. You should expect that you should sit there with the person, not be defensive. If you do notice you're defensive, you need to do supervision after that session, not in it obviously, or you need to go to somebody else in the community and say, would you help me with this? This is what happened. Okay. And in some sense, that's the way I experienced this coming from Eric. I have to have had a hell of an injury about this happening to me and have had healing. It's not that it doesn't bother me at all. Somebody's blaming me for their suffering. And I am a too, and that means I feel like it's my fault. But it's not that huge of a thing anymore, since I have had it happen, oh, God knows, thousands of times. No, what I really more experience is I am happy that the person is coming and telling me this. Because I know, as a therapist, as a teacher, as a whatever I am, that it's hard for people to come to somebody who they admire or who they see as an authority or who they're studying with or who they work for or so on and say, you hurt me. It's hard. It's not easy. So I pushed Eric a little bit more and said, no, you're not picturing. I can feel it. Try to picture. Go to any time in your life where it felt like this. To his credit, within a very brief amount of time, Eric went to a scene in a kindergarten class. And he was, boy, once he was there, he was there. And he could see the room, and he could see the desk, and he could see the teacher. And in this scene, his kindergarten teacher, Miss or Mrs. West, he and I would joke during that. We were joking during this process. At some point, I said the Wicked Witch of the West, and he laughed. And this is a piece of what you add to the emergence. But at this point, there was no joking. He was regressed. He was a little boy, and he had just been yelled at by this teacher. And basically yelled at to stop talking, evidently, something in that vein. That she didn't want to hear him. Okay. A lot of people have had this happen. A lot of children have witnessed other children have it happen to them. How often does it injure children? I'd say probably as often as the dark injures children, and fear of falling and heights, things like that. It's a very common injury. How do you know? Because the set of symptoms where a person is afraid to speak, including as Eric got on the phone with me that day and was nervous about speaking with me, right? That's a part of it. A part of it is that the person might get yelled at. And indeed, this does happen to a lot of us as adults, because the other person will get defensive and mad at you for falsely accusing you, and again and again. But in this case, he was doing great. And he's picturing a woman, and he's picturing her white hair, and he's picturing her glasses. And the beginning of the work that I did with him is I asked him to describe the glasses. And that kindergarten teacher's glasses were different than mine. She was old, I'm old. There were a number of things there that visually fit the pattern. How about the things that don't? Well, this is what I have been saying to you. The wound causes you to be unable to picture things. So he couldn't see any of the differences. And this is really there every single time with every single person with a wound. When you're working on it, the wound will be largely the inability to picture something in that specific area of life. And by area, I mean a very specific, in that time, in that kind of place, and in that kind of experience. Here we are, and Eric is upset because he sent me it isn't even that long, but it's long for an email, and I said what I thought would be a kind, compassionate, and supportive thing. It often means that a person didn't feel they were heard as a child, didn't want to be listened to, etc., and that hurt him. So here he is beginning to connect this to this woman. Now, and this is in no way meant to teach you how to do this, I'm just giving it as an example. So what next? So I had him, a tool that I have often used in Emergence because it's all about reclaiming your visual ability. I had him imagine that he had a television remote control, and that he could stop this woman in her tracks and freeze her at any time. And then I had him do his best to imagine that he was in a seat and she yelled at him that way. And then he was to freeze her face at the end of that sentence or two, whatever she was yelling about him talking, and he needed to freeze it when it was open. So little kids and adults who are reliving being a little kid love these kinds of things. They love some kind of superpower. And here I'm giving him a superpower, a remote control that can control the Witch of the West's mouth and freeze her. And she can't move. Then I have him look down at his desk and see a piece of paper with a whole pile of rabbit turds on them. Hopefully you know what they look like. They look like little round, pea-sized, brown, stinky, whatever, rabbit turds. And I had a rabbit as a child, so I know that firsthand from cleaning up after him. But I had him do this. Now, little boys love the idea of duty, turds. This is something that makes them laugh. So already this is a very positive thing. He has a superpower, and it involves duty. Okay, so now I have him pick up the paper with the rabbit turds in it, and I have him walk up toward the teacher, and I have him stop in front of her, and I say to him, now, take one of those rabbit turds and see if you can throw it in her mouth. And he imagines doing this. I know this because of that rich, full-bodied pause. And I ask him, did it get it in the mouth? Because often people miss in their imagination. But not Eric, right in the mouth. So I have him look down at the paper, pick up another rabbit turd, and try again. Can you get it in a second time? In it goes. Now you see how I'm laughing about this. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Because I'm not regressed. I'm not a little boy, yet I'm laughing. So I then have him go back to his seat, and now I have him sit down, and I have him looking at Miss West, and I have him unfreeze her and watch what her mouth looks like as she realizes what's happened. Now, there's no traditional therapy in the world that would have done any of what I just talked about. I don't think there's a traditional therapist in the world that would believe that it would heal anything. But at the end of that, I tested for healing. And what have I told you? Well, in previous talks, I've told you that the only proof that we accept, if this must be there, this is the required proof, is that when the person is in a situation where they would relive the injury, they have pleasant surprise. That pleasant surprise, that's very different from the symptoms are gone, they're not hurting anymore, they're not mad anymore. None of that. Yeah, that happens. Okay. But if the person has had an emergence, what emerges is more visual material. And when they go back and they revisit that scene, along with it, they see that visual material. And they have the power to find more, because the door is open, and they can walk through, and they can create other things. Now, I am bringing this up. It's in my mind because this morning Eric and I talked about this with another person there, and this came up, and Eric laughed. And I took the moment to point out to Eric that he laughed. And I had said this to him before, but people deserve evidence. They should not be pressured to accept what a therapist says, ever. Not pressured. No. That is not treating a person with respect. And in Emergence, we treat people with respect, including ourselves. But we treat people with respect. And if the person has trouble realizing that they had an emergence, they find it hard to believe that that's changed, showing them evidence that's happening in their body is the absolute best way to see this. When I pointed it out, he laughed. It came up, I don't know, 3 or 4 more times in that conversation. Every time he laughed. There was a tiny sense of that there was still some pain there, a little. And I hope I've explained, at least in the beginning sense, why that's happened, because that first emergence heals 50% of that wall. You can see as if half of the wall was taken down. I also used the time this morning to several times ask him to see if he could see my face. And when he was talking and saying something, I watched that he didn't notice me, which is okay in one sense, but in another, it is necessary that when he's talking and saying things that are important to him, that he is able to see my face or the face of a person there, and to be able to gauge whether they actually are listening and want to hear him. To gauge. Now consider the way that I described healing. Before you heal, you feel certain that this thing, that there's no other way it's going to come out, it's going to be painful, this is the way it's happened, this is the way it's always happened, period. After healing, you have 2 possibilities. That one of them is that it'll still be like that, and sometimes that will happen. But the other possibility is that you will see and be pleasantly surprised by all these things that you never noticed before. And this happened this morning. And he could see my face at times where he was saying things, and I was deliberately expanding on the emergence that he had, whatever, a week or so prior, by getting him to, while he was in some smaller way reliving that somebody doesn't want to hear you, don't talk kind of an injury, getting him to see that I did want to hear him, but to gauge it by his body and my body. No talking, to convince him. Evidence-based. Visual evidence. All of this is about the thing that you will face that I mentioned and didn't name in the beginning of this talk, which has to do with what happens when you give a client an emergence. You clearly see it. It's very obvious. They have pleasant surprise every time you bring it up. What happens, and what's the nature of it? What does this come from? When the person comes back and says, no, I didn't understand, and you helped me to understand it. That's true. But what they're referring to is the old therapy, the therapy of reasoning and talking it out and, using words to change the person's mind. No. Having different ideas doesn't change a person's nature any more than taking a pill for depression changes their nature, at least most times. No, they both change the symptoms temporarily, which it has value, not saying it doesn't, but it's not healing, and it's not permanent. And the only proof is pleasant surprise, but that proof is proof for me. To get another person to see that that's the proof, well, that's one of these enormous, huge realizations. Sometimes emergence therapists work for years, and they don't have it happen to them that way, and they're still operating on, it's been working so far, so I'm going to keep doing it. That's not the same as what happened to Eric. It's clear that he'll not only be looking to see if somebody does want to hear him, but also he knows what an emergence is. It's not just some theoretical thing to him. When he's pleasantly surprised and I point it out, he laughs with me. He laughs not only at their original injury, but he laughs that he's laughing. He sees the evidence that that's what an emergence is, that it has happened to him. And the thing that I have yet to mention, which will come up for you, will be the many, many, many times when clients have had an emergence in your room, you see it, you've assisted them in having it, and then 3 months later, or 2 weeks later, or a year later, you refer to the time when they had it, and they go, no, I figured that out, or I went to a seminar, or, I always knew that. And that one's really important. I always knew that. I knew that. In the early years of me doing emergence therapy, God, would that get to me. It took me several years to realize that people cannot see the moment the emergence happened in. If you can get them to picture the thing that you did with them, then they can relive the emergence and then they have access to it temporarily. But the moment in which you heal often is invisible, despite the fact that you are able to picture all this material that you previously couldn't picture. You were certain that there was something bad going on because you couldn't see it. This is what happened to me when that woman, Judy, was sitting in the car, when the two of us were in the car by the supermarket, and I'm asking her repeatedly, what did I do to you? And she's repeatedly saying, I don't know, but I've done a lot of work on myself, and I know you did something to me. She couldn't picture what I had done. I had no idea that that was even a part of it. I wish I had. So, the little drawing that you're going to see right now, coming up on the screen, the title says, How Healing Changes Consciousness. Kind of heady, consciousness, one of those words, right? But below that there are two drawings, a before and after, about healing. And it says before healing and after healing. And below those there are, on either side, there's a wall, and by now hopefully you know what that wall is like, although I didn't draw it as half the size in the second one, but they're both the blocked area in your mind. Okay. And why did I draw it the same size? Well, the metaphor that I was using for how we see of a wall, where the wall, half of it gets taken down, I'm using that to visually represent that experience. But you see, in reality, the wall doesn't get any smaller. Now, that's probably confusing. But it was important for me to teach you this in this order. What's on this drawing is the more accurate version. In the before healing, on the left side of the wall says, What I Know. And if I can read it, if I can put my glasses on and read it, What I know, the experience I can access. And the red on the top of that says, The suffering is on this side of the wall. I can picture what is on this side of the block. This means I can truly know it in the personal sense, meaning I can experience the beauty in it. Now, that's a strange statement about a wound, but let's set that aside. On the other side of that, the beauty in the other side of it, on the other side, what I know about. So what I know about. We're going to talk about that. We've mentioned it before. The awareness I can access. The awareness I can access. I cannot picture what is on this side of the block, but can, with effort, know about it. Eric knew that somebody had told him, I don't want to hear that. Stop all that talking. Stop talking. He knew about it. But he couldn't picture anything that of the specifics. No picture. This means I cannot experience it, and so cannot even believe it is possible. That's important. I also cannot experience the beauty in what is here. This is what it is like for a person every time that they and you discover a block inside their mind, a walled off part of the mind where they cannot picture anything on the other side. And because they can't picture it, they can't change it. Because they can't picture it, they can't even discern the nature of what's over there, whatever it was. This is largely why people turn to be cognitive therapies, because the logic can make guesses about what's on the other side, some of them very intelligent, some of them even logically correct. They don't heal, because the injury is not about an injury in logic, a lack of thinking. It's an injury in the ability to picture what happened. So now I talked about this story about Eric, and we did Emergence. I did what is formally called visual dialogue with him, and you heard me use a lot of things that are skills, learned skills. I used mechanisms in the imagined scene. I added these mechanisms which fit his age. So he's, I think, 5 or 6 years old, he told me. And so I did things that a 5 or 6 year old boy would really like a superpower, the remote control, and the rabbit turds. Boys love that stuff, right? I used things that fit his personality, and then I took him through a scene where, in a sense, he got his revenge. Now, what he saw at the end of that thing, when I had him go back to his desk and click play on the remote control, and he could see her reaction, her face. I want you to notice that parallels the story that I told you about the man who had molested me and drugged and raped me, and a teenage boy at the time, but he was a man when I then saw him later in my early 20s, and him in his early 20s. And what I saw in his face, the reaction to seeing me and his suffering, exactly parallels what happened to Miss West, the reaction on her face and her suffering. It is an important part of healing that we will talk about many, many, many times and ways. But I'm beginning to try and get you to see that this is a thing in emergence that is everywhere. If something is true, you find that pattern repeated over and over and over again. And it's important that you do see it, because this deepens your belief in that's the nature of human beings. Eric not only healed that, had that first and then had some secondary healing about that, people not wanting to hear his words, but he also had the realization that healing is an aha, that an aha creates the ability to see things and laugh at what used to hurt you, to see the beauty in them. Now, most emergences aren't like what happened to Eric. Most people aren't like Eric. And every time that this happens to Eric, it won't be something memorable. Well, why not? Why can that thing that's such a noticeable change, why can't they see the moment that caused the change? And I say caused in the sense of by nature. What was it that caused the leaves to fall off the tree in October is a natural thing. It's not logic. And what caused Eric to have that aha was not logic. It was a natural sequence, just the same as seasons changing. The same. Why would a person not be able to see the moment in which that happened? Well, look at the second drawing. It says after healing. And after healing, what I know about, the awareness I can access, I cannot picture what is on this side of the block, but can with effort know about it. This means I cannot experience it, and so cannot even believe it is possible. I also cannot experience the beauty in what is here. This is what's important to see, because the fourth piece, the part that's on the other side, what I know about and what I know have changed sides if you look at these two drawings. What I know before healing is the suffering and pain that makes sense of the symptoms. I know that I have this suffering, and I know that I have these reactions in these scenes. And what's on the other side, with logic and traditional therapy, I can know about that other people don't have this and what it might be like intellectually if I didn't have this. I know that other people like climbing high mountains, but I'm afraid. I know that other people love seeing images in shadows, but I'm afraid. I know that other people drive race cars and love it, but I'm afraid. Okay, so knowing about something it exists. It's a mental, intellectual thing. But it's not a personal experience. It's not knowing it as a person. When you heal, you can no longer know what it's like as a person to have the injury. You can know that you had it. And you know so many new things about what you can now picture. All the doors that have opened for you. The ways it's changed your life. Some of them small, like me no longer hearing someone say, eat slower, that food is hot, you'll burn your mouth. I smile involuntarily when I say it to myself. I can picture myself at my desk that day with the injury intellectually, but I can't be that person anymore. Because every time I imagine looking over at Sorrel in that doorway telling me with that kindness to eat slower, I well up, I smile, I feel loved. No matter how hard I try to be that man that used to be like that, I'm not that man. And the wall that exists inside my mind prevents me from seeing it. It doesn't prevent me from knowing about it, and it doesn't keep me from having empathy and compassion for others who are still like that. But I can't be that man. This is what happens when people heal. This was the point of this talk. I could never have said it to you at the beginning. It's probably hard to realize or even see the implications of now. But every time that you help somebody to have an emergence, then at some time in the future you ask them to remember how it happened. 99% of the time or more, they won't be able to remember. Because they're not that person anymore. If you then ask them to picture being the way they used to be, they will know very clearly that they were like that. They will remember the way it used to feel as a result of the injury. But if you ask them to picture a time where they have that injury again, they can't do it. Because they can't see on the other side of the wall now. They can only see on the side of the wall where the door doesn't exist anymore. In some sense, when we walk through one of those doors for an injury, when the door opens and we have an emergence, when we walk through and we're seeing all these things we've never even known existed for us before, even if we knew about them in other people. What happens as we walk through is the door closes behind us. And there's no way to open it again. Now you'll have to take my word for that right now, because that's a huge claim, and you will learn this as we go along sometime in the future. But for now, this has been a long talk. It's been a lot to consider. And it is something that, as an emergence therapist, it will trouble you when you see this happen, and the other person cannot actually remember what you did for them to help them to see the other side of the wall. They can many times know it was you, but they cannot be that wounded person again. They can't picture it. They can remember the symptoms, but they cannot picture a scene and have themselves be that person again. It is not possible. In this series of 5 talks, I have talked about so many things. All of them were the things that I turned to first when I discovered Startles and Emergence in August and September of 1996. I only came to know them in those 3 or 4 years after that summer, slowly, because I immediately was so excited and thinking, I'm just going to tell my clients this, I'm going to show them this, and everybody's going to be excited. I tried showing it to many therapists that I knew, around me, and not one of them. They thought I was, I guess, a lovable crazy man in some way. Anyway, I even did emergences on some of those therapists, just like what I did with Eric. Did they afterwards say anything about it? Nothing. Nothing. It took me years to get past that pain. That one of the things that you sacrifice as an emergence therapist is you sacrifice getting credit for most of what you do. People see how you change their lives, and there's not a person who's ever sat with me and had any kind of a relationship with me who wouldn't say I had changed their life. But were you to ask them for specifics, you'd see how difficult it would be for them to point to them. This is part of what we give up to be emergence practitioners. We give up getting credit from the person we help in a way that's the same size as what we do. I wish there was another way. I am feeling compassion for you right now and trying to imagine what it must be like to hear such a thing. You do something that changes a life permanently. The person knows it happens. You see the evidence. You can show them the evidence by saying, putting them back into it and getting them to laugh about it again. But the event that changed their life, unless you remind them of the details, they have no access usually, almost always. And even if you remind them, that reminder is temporary. They can picture it for a few moments because they're in the same place with the same person who did it. And then it goes away. So, you will have to live with the fact that only other emergence practitioners will be able to truly empathize with you about this. And you get to live with it after a while. It's not so bad. And it's a wonderful way to live a life, to change lives, and to have your own life changed, because that's something that does happen for us. You see, every time we help someone to have an emergence, we can see it. We didn't have the wall. We gain what the person gains. We see the beauty through the other person's eyes in things that perhaps we never even saw the beauty in. We may have known about it and could talk about it and picture it, but seeing beauty in something, that's far more valuable. So we get to see everything, the beauty that the clients get to see. We get to see both sides of it. The side, what it was like, because we saw that client before, we see the after, we can see that. We can see the beauty in the process that we use to help them. But only people like us, people who have learned this, can truly understand what you do. Please know that I will always know what you do. And every time you tell me, I will have that same reaction. That is love, but tears. Both at the same time. As always, I'm so glad you're here. I'm adding, I wish there were a way that this was less difficult for you to learn. But please remember, you going through this difficulty to learn this. This is your love for the world. This is the proof that you are a good human being. I'm glad you're here.